The tray in my hands weighed nothing. Bone china, 2 glasses of a burgundy that cost more than most people's rent, a linen napkin folded the way my mother taught me before she taught me anything else about pride. That was the joke of it. My own mother's hands had shown me how to fold a napkin into a swan, and 26 years later I was using that same fold to serve wine to the woman my husband brought into our home on the night of my 42nd birthday. "Careful!" Doyun said, not looking up from his phone. "That's a $2,000 bottle. Don't waste it the way you waste everything else." The room did not gasp. The room had learned, over 6 years, not to react when Kwon Doyun spoke like that to me. 22 guests sat around my dining table, the one I had chosen slab by slab from a quarry outside Verona, and every single one of them found something fascinating to look at that was not me. The chandelier. Their own hands, the candle flames doing nothing interesting at all. I set the glass down in front of Seren Cho without spilling a drop. She smiled at me the way you smile at a waiter you're about to stiff on the tip. "Thank you," she said, soft and sweet, like she hadn't spent the last 4 months in my husband's hotel suites on the company card. "You have lovely hands for this. For this." As if serving drinks was a skill I'd been born gifted with, instead of a woman being told, in front of her own family, to act like a maid in the house she built. Somewhere behind me, I heard the soft click of silverware set down too carefully Doyun's cousin Insu, pretending to study the pattern on his plate. Across the table, a business associate of the family's cleared his throat and reached for his water instead of his wine, the universal signal of a man who has decided the smartest move tonight is to become furniture. Nobody at that table had the courage to say what they were thinking, which was, simply, "This is wrong," and every one of us is choosing not to say so. I have learned, in 6 years of marriage into a family like this one, that silence at a dinner table is never neutral. It is always a vote. That night, 22 people voted, with their forks and their downcast eyes, to let it happen. I set the tray down on the sideboard, not because I was told to, but because I decided to. And the difference between those two things is the entire reason this story ends the way it does. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of it. I did not cry. I have never cried in front of Kwon Doyun. Not on our wedding day when I found out an hour beforehand that the marriage had been arranged between our families over golf and a real estate deal. Not in 6 years of watching him treat loyalty like something you could rent by the month. I was not going to start on my birthday in a Carolina Herrera gown I paid for with my own money, holding a tray like a woman auditioning for the role of her own replacement. If you're watching this tonight from Charlotte, drop it in the comments below, because I need you to understand this wasn't the moment I broke. This was the moment I started counting. Let me back up, because you need to know who I was before you understand what I became by the end of that night. My name is Desiree Holloway. I kept my name. That detail matters more than you think, and it will matter even more in about 20 minutes of this story. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner's in East Charlotte, the daughter of a nurse and a man who fixed HVAC units for a living. And the first thing either of my parents ever taught me was that nobody was going to hand me anything, so I'd better learn to build it myself. By 29, I had built a boutique hospitality consulting firm from nothing, helping struggling hotels and private clubs restructure themselves into places rich people actually wanted to be seen. By 32, I had a name in 3 cities. By 36, I met Kwon Doyun at a gala I was working, not attending. And within 8 months, our families had arranged a marriage neither of us asked for. In the old tradition, his family still half believed in the Kwons, needed a legitimate face for their expanding hospitality holdings. And my father, terrified of losing everything after a bad investment, needed the debt relief that came bundled with my hand. Call it a comfort mafia marriage if you want a name for it. 2 families, 1 contract, 0 romance at least. That's what I told myself for the first year. Back when Doyun still tried, in his clumsy way, to make the arrangement feel like something more than a merger with a wedding cake. He learned my coffee order without being told. He flew a chef in from Busan the first time I mentioned missing my grandmother's jai. For about 14 months, I thought maybe this was going to be one of those slow burn romance stories people don't believe happen in real life. 2 strangers thrown together by other people's ambitions, finding something true underneath the arrangement. I let myself want that. I am not ashamed of having wanted it. Then his father promoted him to run the legitimate holdings directly, And something in Doyun changed the way water changes when you finally turn the heat all the way up. He stopped asking about my day. He started introducing me, at parties, as my wife. She used to do something in hospitality used to. Like the thing I built had a shelf life. Like the thing that put a roof over both our heads had quietly expired the day I married into a family with an older, louder kind of money. I watched him learn to perform confidence in board meetings using language I had written for him at midnight, and I watched him accept the applause like it belonged to him alone. I walked into that marriage with my eyes open and my ambitions intact, and for 6 years I did something Doyun Kwon never once thought to ask me about. I built his family's entire legitimate empire from the shadows, while he took every ounce of the credit at every gala, every board meeting, every headline. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this because by the end of tonight, you're going to understand exactly how expensive it was for him to forget it. Back at the table, Seren was still talking, because women like her never know when silence is the smarter move. Doyun tells me you used to work events like this, she said, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem. Before! It must be nice, coming full circle. There is a specific kind of insult reserved for women who think proximity to a powerful man makes them powerful themselves. Seren Cho had been a hostess at the Kwon family's private club 18 months earlier. I knew this because I had personally approved the club's hiring roster the year she started, back when I still ran point on staffing for every property under the Kwon umbrella, back when Doyun called that just Desiree's little hobby at dinner parties. She had gone from pouring soju for syndicate captains to sitting at my table wearing a bracelet I recognized because I was the one who'd negotiated the wholesale price on it for a corporate gifting order 2 Christmases ago. It is nice, I said, and smiled, because composure isn't the absence of anger. It's what anger looks like when it decides to wait. Doyun's father sat 2 seats down from him, silent, the way Kwon Sang-ho always was at family gatherings, a man who'd built the family's original fortune on things nobody said out loud anymore, and who now spent his evenings watching his son run the legitimate side of the operation with the same patience he'd once used watching a hand of cards he already knew he was going to win. He hadn't said a word all night. He hadn't needed to. Chairman Kwon watched everything. "Sit down, Desiree," Doyun said, waving a hand at the empty chair at the foot of the table. My seat, the one I'd been standing beside for the last 40 minutes because my husband had decided, apparently, that his mistress deserved my attention more than my own birthday dinner did. "You've done enough for tonight," I sat. 22 people watched me sit in the seat at the far end of my own table, the one closest to the kitchen doors, and not one of them said a word, because in 6 years, not one of them had ever seen me lose. And a room full of people who have never seen you lose will still, given the chance, watch you lose without lifting a finger to stop it. That's not cruelty. That's just what a crowd does. It waits to see which way the wind is blowing before it decides whose side it was always on. I want you to remember that detail, because it comes back later, and when it does, I promise you it comes back expensive. To Seren, Doyun said, raising his glass, for reminding me what actual warmth looks like. 21 glasses lifted. Mine did not. I picked up my water instead, and I looked at my husband, really looked at him. The way you look at a stranger you're deciding whether to trust with directions, and I let myself remember, just for 1 second, the version of him I'd met at that gala 6 years earlier, the one who'd asked me 3 separate questions about hospitality margins before he ever asked me my name. That man was still in there somewhere. He'd just decided, somewhere along the way, that it was easier to be the man his father's world expected him to be than the man he'd started out as. That's not an excuse. It's just an explanation, and I stopped needing those a long time before tonight. If tonight is about warmth, I said, and my voice did not shake, then let's talk about temperature. Because I think a few people at this table are about to find out how cold it gets when the person who's been keeping them warm decides she's done. Seren laughed, a short, bright, dismissive sound. "Dramatic," she said to Doyun, like I wasn't sitting 6 feet away. "Is she always like this?" "She's tired," Doyun said. "It happens when you stop being useful and start being bitter." Useful. That was the word he chose. Not loyal. Not brilliant. Not the reason his family's name was still worth something in 3 cities and 2 countries. Useful, like I was a tool he'd left out in the rain. Doyun tapped his glass with a fork, and the sound cut through the room the way it always did, because 6 years of marriage had taught this family exactly one thing about him. When Doyun Kwon wanted attention, he expected to get it without asking twice. "Since everyone's here," he said, "I want to make an announcement. Seren is going to be taking on a more formal role with the family. Hospitality relations. Managing our property's guest experience division, starting with Meridian Bay." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward, touching every face at that table one at a time. Meridian Bay. My project. My deal, structured by my company, financed against my relationships, and my husband was standing at my birthday dinner handing operational control of it to a woman who 18 months earlier had been pouring drinks for syndicate captains at his family's private club. "That's a significant appointment," Chairman Kwon said carefully. The first thing he'd said all night, and I heard, underneath the careful phrasing, a man trying to decide how much rope to give his son before he pulled it back. "She has good instincts," Doyun said. "Better than some people give her credit for. Some people. He meant me." He said it looking directly at me, and Seren's smile widened by exactly the amount you'd expect from a woman who had just been handed a job she hadn't earned, in front of the one person in the room who knew precisely how much work that job actually required. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of answer. "Congratulations," I said finally, to Seren, and I meant something entirely different by it than the word usually means, though only one person at that table would understand exactly how different, and it wasn't going to be her. Doyun's cousin Insu leaned toward the man beside him and murmured something I didn't catch, and the man laughed, quiet and quick, the kind of laugh people give when they think the joke is safely out of earshot. I caught the shape of it anyway. I had spent 6 years learning to read a room the way other women learn to read weather, and I knew, watching that small, careless laugh pass between two men who owed their comfortable lives to a business I'd quietly propped up for half a decade, that I would remember exactly whose face that laugh belonged to when the time came to decide who still deserved my trust going forward. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I didn't look at it yet. I already knew who it was, because I had scheduled this call myself 4 days earlier, back when I still thought I might not need it. Some plans you build as insurance. This one, I built as a mercy, one last chance for my husband to remember who I was before I stopped reminding him for free. He didn't take it, so the room was about to. The knock at the door came 11 minutes later, right on time, and my head of household staff, a quiet, careful man named Terence, who had worked for my family longer than I'd been married, opened it to find a man in a charcoal suit standing on the porch with 2 associates behind him and a driver still idling a car worth more than most people's houses at the curb. "Alexander Voss," Terence announced, "for Mrs. Holloway." The table went quiet in the specific way. A table goes quiet when nobody recognizes a name, but everybody recognizes the weight of it. Alexander Voss ran Halcyon Capital, the private equity firm that had, over the last 5 years, financed nearly every major hospitality acquisition the Kwon family's legitimate holding company had made. Doyun had shaken his hand exactly twice, both times at industry dinners, both times introduced by someone else. I had spoken to Alexander Voss 41 times in the last 5 years, because I was the one who structured every single deal his firm ever financed for Kwon Hospitality Group, using a private holding entity nobody at that table had ever heard the name of, because I had never once put my name on the letterhead. "Desiree," Alexander said, crossing the room, ignoring the head of the table entirely. "I'm sorry to interrupt your birthday, but the Meridian Bay term sheet needs your signature by midnight or we lose the rate lock. I told my assistant I'd rather drive it over myself than let $190 million slip through a clerical delay. $190 million. I watched the number land on Doyun's face like a slap he hadn't seen coming. "I'm sorry," Doyun said, standing, laughing a little, the confused kind of laugh men do when the ground has started moving and their mouth hasn't caught up yet. "Meridian Bay is a Kwon hospitality deal. I signed the LOI on that project myself." Alexander looked at him the way you look at a stranger who's just claimed credit for your favorite restaurant. "You signed the letter of intent your wife's holding company drafted," he said, not unkindly, just factually, the way men who move $190 million for a living tend to speak. "Halcyon doesn't lend against Kwon Hospitality's balance sheet. We lend against Ashworth Meridian Holdings, Desiree's entity. Has been for 3 years. If you're waiting for the moment this story turns, comment resonant below, because I want you to sit in this one with me for a second, because I did not build my silence out of weakness. I built it out of strategy, and strategy only works if you're patient enough to let the truth arrive on its own schedule instead of yours. For 3 years, Doyun Kwon had believed he was the architect of his own family's biggest wins. Meridian Bay, the Castellane acquisition the year before, the refinance that saved the Kwon Riverside properties from a margin call that would have gutted the family's legitimate portfolio during the worst quarter his father's organization had seen in a decade. Every single one of those deals had moved through Ashworth Meridian Holdings, my company, named for my mother's maiden name and a city I'd never lived in on purpose, so nobody would ever connect the dots back to a housewife they'd stopped taking seriously the day the ring went on her finger. I hadn't hidden my success out of shame. I'd hidden it because a woman who is underestimated gets to watch everyone show her exactly who they are. And I wanted to know, before I ever needed to know, exactly which of the people at that table would still respect me if they thought I had nothing left to offer them. Now I knew. "That's not possible," Doyun said, and for the first time all night, his voice had lost its edge. "I built that portfolio. You closed meetings I set up," I said quietly, because there was no need to raise my voice when the truth was already doing all the shouting for me. "You signed contracts my team drafted. You gave interviews about strategy I wrote, the talking points for at 2 in the morning while you were in Macau with people I never asked you about. I let you have the credit, Doyun, because I didn't need it. I needed the family's business to survive. And I needed your father to trust that his son could run something. I gave you 6 years of being the man everyone believed you were." Chairman Kwon had not moved, but his eyes had. "6 years," Seren repeated, quieter now, some of the shine gone out of her voice. "You built his entire company." "I built my company," I corrected her. "He just got to stand in front of the cameras. Let me give you the receipts, since apparently this family has never once asked to see them." The Castellane acquisition Mr. Ambe just mentioned Doyun told a business journal 18 months ago that he'd seen the opportunity early and moved fast on instinct. What actually happened is I spent 4 months rebuilding a relationship with the Castellane family's estate trustees after Doyun's father's organization had burned that bridge a decade earlier over a dispute nobody in this room remembers the details of anymore. And I did it using my maiden name and a hospitality consulting contract, so nobody on either side would connect it back to a Kwon. The Riverside refinance, the one that kept 11 properties out of a margin call during the worst quarter this family's legitimate business had seen in a decade, Doyun called 3 investors and read a script from a legal pad. I wrote that script. I had already secured verbal commitments from 2 of those investors a week earlier over a lunch nobody at this table was invited to. And Meridian Bay, the deal Doyun just handed to a woman with 18 months of hospitality experience. I spent 3 years building the zoning relationships that made that project possible at all. 1 city council dinner and 1 small, unglamorous favor at a time, because empires are never built in the room where the ribbon gets cut. They're built in the years of rooms nobody bothers to film. I did all of it without my name on a single press release, because I believed, foolishly, that a marriage was a partnership, and that a partner doesn't need public credit if the private trust is real. I was wrong about exactly one part of that. The trust was never real. Not on his side. Alexander Voss cleared his throat, the discreet cough of a man who has just realized he walked into the middle of something much larger than a signature. I can come back," he offered. "No," I said, and I stood, smoothing the front of my gown, feeling for the first time all night like the dress fit the way it was supposed to. "Stay. I think everyone at this table is about to learn something they should have asked about years ago." Alexander had barely reached the door to leave when a second car pulled into the drive, a black Bentley I recognized, before I recognized the man stepping out of it. Katsuro Ambe owned 19 luxury properties across 4 countries and had, until that moment, only ever met my husband twice, both times at industry dinners where Doyun had done most of the talking and Mr. Ambe had done most of the listening. "Mrs. Holloway," Mr. Ambe said, letting Terence show him in without waiting for an invitation, the way men of a certain stature do when they've decided a conversation matters more than a doorbell. "Forgive the intrusion. I tried your office line first. Your assistant said you'd be here. It's my birthday, Mr. Ambe, I said, and something in my voice must have told him exactly how strange an evening this had already become, because he glanced once around the table at Seren's half-empty glass, at Doyun standing frozen by his chair, at Chairman Kwan's unreadable expression, and chose his next words carefully. I'll be brief, then. The Castellane Skyline Tower. 480 million, closing next quarter. My board wanted it known, before the press release goes out Monday, that we're only comfortable moving forward because of your personal guarantee on the cultural district zoning relationships. Not the Kwan name. Yours. I told them I'd rather say that to your face than let a press release say it for me. $480 million, attributed, out loud, in front of 22 witnesses, to a woman half that room had spent the evening watching carry a wine tray like she'd been born to it. That's not, Doyun started, and stopped, because there was nowhere left for the sentence to go that didn't end in an admission. I know how these projects usually get announced, Mr. Ambe said, and if he noticed the temperature of the room, he was too polished to show it. Somebody stands in front of a camera and calls it a family win. I've done business with a great many families who like to call it that. I've learned to ask, privately, who actually did the work, because those are usually two very different names. He looked at Doyun, not unkindly, the way you might look at a man you'd just accidentally disarmed. In this case, they're not even in the same room most nights, from what I understand. The second knock came before I even sat back down my assistant, Priya, who I trusted with things I did not trust with my own family, walking in with a slim folder under her arm and an expression I recognized because I had trained her to keep it. Calm. Controlled. The face of someone who is about to hand you a bomb wrapped in very good manners. You said to bring this the moment it was confirmed, Priya said, and set the folder in front of me instead of Doyun, because she knew, even before I told the room, exactly whose house this still was. I opened it. Bank transfer records. Encrypted messages, decrypted the legal way, the boring way, the way that doesn't need a courtroom because it only needs the truth to exist in one document instead of scattered across 100 deniable conversations. 4 months of Seren Cho selling operational details about Kwan Hospitality's expansion timeline to a rival syndicate out of the Song family. The same family Doyun's father had spent a decade keeping at arm's length. The same family that had tried twice in the last 3 years to muscle into territory the Kwans considered untouchable. "What is that?" Doyun said, and it wasn't a question anymore. It was a man watching his night end in real time and trying to slow it down through sheer force of denial. "Ask her," I said, and slid the folder down the table until it stopped in front of Seren's wine glass. Seren did not reach for it. That told me everything the folder didn't need to. "I don't know what that is," she said. Too fast, the first crack in a voice that had spent the whole evening sounding like silk. "It's 4 months of wire transfers from a shell account tied to the Song family's investment arm," Priya said, calm as ever, routed through a hospitality consulting invoice that doesn't correspond to any actual work performed. It's also 6 voice memos where you describe, in detail, the layout of the Meridian Bay security contracts before that information had been shared with anyone outside this family. "Would you like me to play one?" Chairman Kwan spoke for the first time all night. "No," he said, "just that." One word, in a voice that had negotiated things far heavier than a wine list, and the entire table went still in a way I had never once seen it go still for his son. He looked at Seren the way you look at something you already know how the story ends for, and then he looked at his son the way you look at a man who let a stranger walk information about your family's most vulnerable exposure straight into the hands of people who had spent a decade trying to find exactly that kind of opening. "You brought her into this house," Chairman Kwan said to Doyun, quiet, controlled, worse than shouting would have been. "You brought her near the business, near the family, near everything I built so that our name would mean something more than what it used to mean in this city." "Father, I didn't know, you didn't ask," Chairman Kwan said. "You never ask. You take, Doyun. You have always taken. Your wife built you an empire and you didn't think to ask how. You brought a stranger into our home and you didn't think to ask who. A man who does not ask questions is a man who gets exactly what happened here tonight. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not orchestrate the Song family connection. I found it, Yes, I make it my business to know who touches my company's exposure, and Seren Cho had gotten close enough to Kwon Hospitality's internal calendar to become a problem I needed solved regardless of my marriage. But I want you to understand the difference between revenge and consequence, because it matters to how I live with myself. I didn't plant that folder to destroy two people. I built it because a woman who runs $190 million worth of other people's trust does not get to be careless about who's whispering in her husband's ear, marriage or no marriage. The timing that his mistress turned out to be selling secrets to the one family his father feared most, on the same night he humiliated me in front of 22 witnesses, that timing was not my doing. That timing was just what happens when you stop paying attention to the woman who's been protecting you and start trusting the one who's been performing for you instead. If you're keeping score, comment respect below, because that's the only word I had left in me by that point in the evening, and I mean it for every woman watching this who has ever built something in silence while someone else took the applause. Doyun stood up so fast his chair scraped the Verona marble. "Get out," he said to Seren. "Get out of my house." "It's not your house," I said. The table turned to look at me, and for the first time all night, I let them see exactly how calm I actually was. Because calm, real calm, the kind that comes from already knowing how a story ends, is the most unsettling thing you can show a room that expected you to break. "This house is in Ashworth Meridian Holdings' name," I said. "It has been for 4 years, since the refinance that saved this family's Riverside portfolio structured that way because your father's accountant recommended it for tax purposes and none of you ever bothered to read the paperwork past the signature line. Every deed, every asset in this dining room, every bottle of that Burgundy mine. Not because I wanted a trophy. Because I was the only one in this family who ever thought to ask what happens if the marriage doesn't work out. Apparently, I was the only one who thought that far ahead. Seren's face had gone the particular shade of pale that comes right before people start bargaining. "Doyun," she said, "tell her this isn't." "Don't," Doyun said, and for the first time all night, I heard something in his voice that wasn't performance. It sounded almost like grief. "Don't say my name like you have any right to." I stood, and I walked to the head of the table, my seat, the one I'd built with my own money and kept for 6 years out of a courtesy I no longer owed anyone, and I looked out at 22 faces who, an hour earlier, had watched me carry a tray like a woman who'd finally been put in her place. "I want to be very clear about something," I said, "because I think some of you are still confused about what happened here tonight. I did not lose anything. I gave for 6 years out of loyalty to a family that never once asked what it cost me. Tonight, I stopped giving. That's not a tragedy. That's a correction." Chairman Kwon rose from his seat, slowly, the way older men do when they've decided a room needs to remember who still holds the most weight in it. "Desiree," he said, and it was the first time in 6 years he had ever used my first name instead of calling me his son's wife. "I owe you an apology I should have given a long time ago." I knew, in a general sense, that the business had grown stronger than it had any right to under Doyun's stewardship alone. I told myself it was his instincts. I did not want to look closer, because looking closer would have meant admitting the truth that my son built nothing, and the woman I let my family treat as decoration built all of it. "You don't owe me an apology, Chairman Kwon," I said. "You owe your son a harder conversation than the one you're having with me. I'm not the one who needs to learn what he lost tonight." I hadn't taken off the tiara yet, the one my staff had surprised me with earlier that evening. A small, silly, glittering thing to go with the gold gown I'd chosen for my own birthday, before I knew the night was going to ask more of me than a crown made of rhinestones. I reached up now and settled it properly, because there is a kind of theatre that matters, and I have never once been afraid of being the woman standing at the centre of her own story wearing something that looks like a crown, because by that point in the evening, it wasn't just decoration anymore. "Terence," I said, "would you have the guest suite emptied? Mr. Kwon and Miss Cho won't be staying tonight." Terence didn't blink. 2 of my security staff were already moving before I finished the sentence, and within minutes, there were suitcases in the front hall, Seren's overnight bag from the guest wing. And, at my direction, every piece of luggage Doyun kept at that house, because a man does not get to decide, at midnight, that he still lives somewhere he humiliated his wife 8 hours earlier. I walked them both to the door myself. I wanted to. Some moments you delegate, and some moments you claim, and I had earned the right to watch this one happen with my own eyes. "Desiree!" Doyun said, standing on the porch beside his luggage, the porch light throwing his shadow long across the driveway. "It's my birthday too, in a way. This is still—" "It was never yours," I said, and I lifted my hand, palm out, the way you stop traffic, the way you stop a man who has spent 6 years assuming every door in his life would open the moment he reached for it. Not the house, not the company, and as of tonight, not the marriage either. You don't get to stand on this porch and negotiate your way back into a life you spent an entire evening proving you never respected. Saren opened her mouth to say something, some version of an apology, or maybe another attempt at a bargain. I'll never know which, because I didn't let her finish it. "You can save it," I told her. "You weren't sorry when you thought it was working." Doyun's jaw worked, and for a second I watched 26 years of a man's certainty about his own importance try to find somewhere to stand and come up with nowhere. "Desiree!" he said, and his voice cracked in a way I had genuinely never heard it crack before. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know any of it." "I know," I said. "That's the problem." I would love to tell you the rest of the night was clean and simple, that I said my piece and everyone filed out in orderly disgrace while a string quartet played something triumphant. It wasn't like that. It took another 2 hours, and it took Chairman Kwon making 4 phone calls at my dining table that I will not repeat the details of, because some consequences a family handles inside its own walls, and I have never needed an audience to know I won. What I can tell you is what happened by morning, because those numbers are public record, and I like public record. Public record doesn't get to lie about who did the work. By 8 the next morning, Halcyon Capital had frozen every pending disbursement tied to Kwon Hospitality Group's operating accounts, pending a full review of the company's internal security following the Song family breach, a review Alexander Voss insisted on personally, given, in his words, the scale of the exposure and the fact that the woman who actually runs this portfolio is the one who caught it. 3 institutional partners who had backed the Meridian Bay project quietly asked, over the course of that week, to restructure their agreements to name Ashworth Meridian Holdings as the primary signatory instead of Kwon Hospitality Group, not because I asked them to, but because trust, once it finds out where it was actually earned, tends to relocate itself without being asked. Kwon Hospitality Group's stock, the small public float the family had listed 2 years earlier against my strong advice, because Doyun had wanted the prestige of a ticker symbol dropped 18% in a single trading session once word of the security breach reached 3 financial reporters who did not need my help finding the story, because I never leaked a single detail. I didn't have to. A $190 million rate lock nearly lost on the same night. A mistress turned out to be feeding a rival syndicate. Your operational calendar is not a story that needs help traveling. It travels on its own, fast, the way bad news always does when the good news was built on a lie. Chairman Kwon stripped his son of signing authority over every account tied to the legitimate holding structure within 72 hours, not out of cruelty, he told me later, over coffee, in a conversation that surprised us both, but because a man who cannot protect his own house from a stranger cannot be trusted with a family's exposure to the world. Doyun kept his name on the door. He kept nothing else. The captains who had spent 6 years calling him young master with a straight face started, within the month, routing every real decision through his father's office directly, the way they'd done before Doyun was ever old enough to sit at that table. I heard, second-hand, that at the first captain's meeting after the breach, one of the older men, a quiet, careful man named Junho, who had been with the family since before Doyun was born, asked Chairman Kwon a single question in front of the room. Who had actually protected the family's exposure all these years? The son they'd trained for the role, or the wife nobody had bothered to train for anything because they assumed she didn't need it? Chairman Kwon didn't answer him directly. He didn't have to. He simply had my name added to the standing invitation list for every quarterly briefing going forward. And in a family like that one, an invitation says everything a sentence never could. Doyun was not on that list. He hadn't been removed from it out of spite. He had simply never been the one they needed in the room to begin with, and it had taken a stranger selling secrets to a rival family for anyone to say so out loud. I won't pretend there wasn't a strange, small grief in watching that happen to him. 6 years is a long time to build a life next to someone, even a life built mostly out of obligation and misplaced trust. But grief and forgiveness are not the same transaction, and I have never confused generosity with the erasure of accountability. Doyun made 100 small choices over 6 years that led to one very large consequence, and a man does not get to skip the bill just because the woman he stopped seeing finally decided to stop paying it for him. Seren Cho disappeared from the city inside of 10 days. I don't know everything that happened to her, and I've made peace with not knowing, because some consequences aren't mine to narrate. What I do know is that no hotel, club, or restaurant connected to the Kwon family's decade of relationships in 3 states would return her calls after that folder became a conversation instead of a secret, and a woman who built her entire leverage on being wanted by powerful men tends to find the floor drops out fast once the powerful men she was counting on stop being powerful or stop being willing to be seen with her at all. The Song family, for their part, denied everything, the way families like that always do, and quietly ended whatever arrangement they'd had with her, because even the people paying for stolen secrets don't want to be caught holding the woman who got sloppy enough to leave a paper trail. I heard, months later, from someone who used to work the front desk at the club where Seren first started, that she'd tried to get hired at a boutique property 2 cities over, using a name that wasn't quite her own and a resume that skipped the last 2 years entirely. The hiring manager called Priya to verify a reference that didn't check out, purely as a courtesy between people in the same industry. And that was the end of it. It wasn't me who closed that door. I didn't have to lift a finger. A woman who spends her currency on being someone's secret finds out, eventually, that the currency doesn't spend anywhere else. And there is no revenge I could have engineered that would have landed harder than simply letting her discover that on her own, in real time, with nobody left to call. That's the price, if you were wondering. Not a courtroom. Not a headline with anyone's face on it. Just the specific, quiet, permanent kind of ruin that happens when the whole ecosystem that made you feel powerful decides, all at once, that you're not worth the risk anymore. The small things came just as fast, and I won't pretend they didn't feel good in their own quiet way. Insu, the cousin who'd cleared his throat and studied his plate instead of speaking up, lost his junior seat on the Kwon Hospitality Advisory Board within the month, once Chairman Kwon started asking, one by one, exactly who at that table had known something was wrong and said nothing. The business associate who'd reached for his water instead of his wine found his firm quietly excluded from the next 3 deals Ashworth Meridian financed, not out of spite, but because I no longer had any interest in doing business with men who'd watched a woman get humiliated at her own table and decided the safest move was furniture. 2 of the guests who'd laughed the loudest at Seren's dramatic comment sent flower arrangements to my office the following week, the specific, apologetic kind of flowers people send when they've realized which way the wind actually blew. I didn't respond to either of them. Some apologies don't need an answer. They just need to be noticed and then set aside. My mother called the morning after the party, the way she always did after anything important happened in my life, whether or not I'd told her about it yet. She had a way of knowing. I heard, she said, without preamble, because 30 years of nursing had trained her to skip the small talk when something actually mattered. Priya called your father, said you were magnificent. I served wine to my husband's mistress at my own birthday dinner, Mama. And then you took your house back, your company back, and your name back, all in one night, without raising your voice once, she said. I didn't raise you to fall apart in front of people who were waiting to watch you fall apart. I raised you to make them wait so long they forgot what they were waiting for. I sat with that for a moment, in my kitchen, in the quiet after everyone else had gone, and I thought about the girl I used to be, above the dry cleaners, watching my mother come home from double shifts with her feet swollen and her spine straight anyway, because that was the only kind of posture she ever let herself be seen in. I understood, in that moment, more clearly than I had in 6 years of marriage, exactly whose daughter I actually was, and exactly why no amount of old family money had ever managed to make me small. Are you happy? She asked, and it was such a simple question, and nobody, in 6 years, had thought to ask me that one either. I will be, I told her. I'm not there yet, but I will be. Doyun asked me for a divorce 11 days later, standing in the kitchen of the house that was legally mine, holding a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. I know I don't deserve to ask you this, he said, but is there anything I could have done differently? Is there a version of this where I don't lose everything? I thought about lying to him, because there's a kindness in a clean ending, and some small, tired part of me wanted to give him one. But I didn't build 6 years of quiet, careful work out of a woman who lies to make men feel better about the choices they made. You could have asked me one question in 6 years, I said. Just one. What do you need? What do you want? Are you happy? You never asked, Doyun, because you never once considered that the answer might require something of you. That's not a marriage. That's a business arrangement where only one of us was doing the work, and I finally stopped being willing to be the only one who noticed. He nodded, and he left, and I want you to know that I felt something that morning that I hadn't expected to feel, not triumph, exactly, and not grief either. Something quieter than both. Relief, maybe. The specific relief of a woman who spent 6 years building an empire in someone else's shadow and finally got to stand in her own light and watch it turn out the light had been hers the entire time. Chairman Kwon offered me full operational control of Kwon Hospitality Group's legitimate holdings 3 weeks later, structured as a formal partnership with Ashworth Meridian. My name on the letterhead this time. No shadows, no shell entities, no 6 years of pretending I was just somebody's wife. The new entity carries both our names now. 61% Ashworth Meridian, 39% Kwon, a number Chairman Kwon insisted on himself, because, he told me, a man should know exactly how much of his own house he no longer owns, so he never forgets to earn the rest back, honestly. Kwon Hospitality's stock recovered within 4 months, climbing 11% past its old high once the market understood the real leadership was staying and the instability was the part that had walked out the door. I said yes to the partnership, not because I needed his approval, but because I'd built too much to walk away from it out of pride, and because a smart woman knows the difference between burning a house down and simply deciding, finally, who gets to live in it. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the version of this story where I never had to build any of it in the shadows at all, where somebody had simply asked me, on day one, what I wanted, instead of 6 years later, at the exact moment I stopped needing them to ask. That's the quiet tragedy underneath every underdog story like mine. It isn't that we lacked the talent. It's that we had to prove it twice once to build it, and once again just to be believed. I don't say that bitterly anymore. I say it the way you'd narrate somebody else's audiobook romance, at a distance, with the ending already known, because I made peace with my part of it a long time before I ever agreed to tell you any of this. I threw the party myself. 6 months later, the anniversary of the night, everything changed, in the same dining room, at the same table. Except this time, the seat at the head of it had my name on the place card, and nobody at that table needed to be told twice whose house it was. People ask me sometimes, now that the story's made its way around enough dinner tables and enough industry circles that I've stopped being surprised when a stranger recognizes my name at a conference, whether I regret the 6 years I spent building someone else's empire in silence. I don't. I built a version of myself in those years that nobody handed me and nobody can take away. And I learned, the hard way, exactly which relationships in my life were built on respect and which ones were built on convenience. That knowledge is worth more than the 6 years cost me. I wouldn't trade the lesson to get the years back cheaper. I still see Chairman Kwon twice a month at the quarterly briefings, and there is a version of respect between us now that never existed when I was simply his son's wife. He asked me once, not long after everything settled, why I never came to him directly, in all those years, to tell him what his son was really like behind closed doors. I told him the truth, because a woman who tells on her husband to his father is asking to be believed, and I had already learned, by then, that being believed was never going to be handed to me. I decided a long time ago that I would rather be undeniable than believed. Undeniable doesn't need anyone's permission. It just needs time, and the patience to let the receipts speak instead of your voice. Doyun reached out again, about 4 months after the divorce was finalized. A short message asking if we could talk, no agenda attached. I didn't answer it right away. When I finally did, I told him I hoped he found whatever he was looking for, and that I meant it sincerely, and that I would not be the person who helped him look for it. Some doors close clean. I have never once regretted letting that one stay closed. If you've made it this far, I want you to hear this clearly. because it's the only piece of advice I have to give. The world will let you carry the tray for exactly as long as you're willing to carry it. Nobody takes it out of your hands for you. You put it down yourself the day you finally decide your own name is worth more than the peace of staying quiet about what you built. I put mine down on my birthday. I haven't picked it back up since.